Let's talk about these latest updates with Brian Kohlberger and the Idaho 4 plus the roommates. What does this mean for the defense? What does this mean for the state? And what does this mean for everybody else? All that being said, everything's alleged. Welcome to the point. Let's get to it.
Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, scholarship, and research. Fair use is a use permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in favor of fair use.
Before we get to Brian, let's talk about the roommates because we have more information on what they did the morning of the attack. Because we all know what was said within the probable cause affidavit was crap. It certainly looked like crap. And to a degree, a lot of that's validated. But listen to this.
Newly revealed information in the Idaho student case is what's trending in true crime this morning. Court documents are revealing more details of the communications done between surviving roommates of these four beautiful students who were the victims: Maddie Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin.
And who honestly bought this frozen shock phase, saw an incident, and went back to bed, slept till 11 o'clock, and then called the police? Their actions and behaviors will be a problem for both parties when this comes up.
Now, on the morning they were in their Moscow, Idaho home, there was texting going on, and we previously reported about a little bit of it between Bethany Funk and Dylan Mortensen. They are their surviving roommates. And we shared with you some of the terrified text messages moments right after the took place.
And when we were going over those text messages and talking about the text messages, what was said then is, how are they so freaked out? How are they so bothered by what they saw? How are they in a panic with Bethany telling Dylan, run down to my room, and then turning around and going to bed? You would think if you're that terrified, that scared, your first action would be to call 911. Now I get it, the state is saying they had no idea this was going on. But obviously they knew something was going on. But we have more information and more details. Because there were individuals saying, well, at that night, yes, they were freaked out. They weren't sure what was going on. They didn't want to call police, so they went to bed and then woke up and called police. But there's way more to this story. They were up long before they called 911.
But now the defense team wants to bring in more messaging apps to show that these two surviving roommates were awake for much of the morning, awake in the house after the didn't go back to sleep, as many people interested in this case assumed. Investigators believe those took place between 4 a.m. and 4:25 a.m. So there's now more information on both Mortensen's and Funk's social media accounts and their movements, showing what happened later that morning. The defense points to wanting Mortensen and Funk and what they were doing with their phones to come in. And they say that it really points to the time frame. So let's give you a little bit of a look at the interactions. 7:30 a.m., Funk calls her dad. Around 8:05 till all the way to 10 a.m. roughly, Dylan Mortensen's on Instagram. 8:42 to 8:44, Bethany Funk is taking pictures. 10 a.m. to 10:01, Dylan Mortensen is messaging. We've got incoming and outgoing Snapchats happening. 10:03, 10:04, Mortensen is on Indeed. So here's what we're asking this morning.
You know, hats off for looking out for your future, but there's a big problem in your home. Let's remember early on in this investigation, individuals were saying students in Idaho knew there was a crime committed. There were already rumors floating around about what had happened in that home long before police got there. Those were the headlines. Those were some of the stories that were coming out very early. And if they're up and on their phones, looking at Snapchat, looking at Instagram between 8 and 10 o'clock, were these the individuals that leaked that information to the students? That is a question. And if they did leak this information, why didn't they call 911 earlier? Now, I know people online have said, well, they were cleaning, they were a part of this crime. And I understand it because this certainly looks suspicious. And you would think that law enforcement investigated both of these individuals heavily. We know they got a hold of their phones. We know they downloaded the information from their phones. And apparently they found nothing. But is their behavior something that can cast doubt on a jury? Is their behavior something the defense can use? Or does all this offer validity to the state in terms of the timeline?
What these messages and what the phone records might reveal about the timeline. Who do they help in this case? Let's bring in the chief of police at Talladega College, retired Detective Chris Anderson is with us and want to welcome in criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor David Bruno. Great to see you both. Chief, let me begin with you, please. These messages after the window, detectives believe the occurred. What, if anything, do they help establish for the state's case against defendant Bryan Kohberger?
Oh, they helped the state's case a lot because they established that timeline of when it could have occurred. There's a lot that goes into a case like this when you just have pretty much circumstantial evidence. But these text messages will be key in layering on that evidence that may help convict Kohberger, but they go to help both sides, I think.
And he is, in my opinion, correct. The roommates' behavior go towards both sides in helping them bolster their particular argument. In terms of how this helps the state, it does tie down their timeline. It does seem to make their timeline more accurate. We know he was here at this particular moment because then we have these text messages from the roommates saying they heard stuff and they were alerted. So yes, from that aspect, it does help the state. The problem is what they did after they heard all this stuff go down. When you listen to that 911 call, they were absolutely freaked out. They sounded completely distraught. But the defense can say, well, if they were so distraught, why didn't they call 911 sooner? And when they woke up, why didn't they call 911? Why were they on Snapchat, Instagram, and Indeed? These clearly aren't the behaviors of a group of people who are obviously freaked out about what happened last night. They seem to go on about their morning as they would every morning. Get on social media, take a bunch of pictures, and answer emails and talk to friends. So there are aspects of both of their behavior that will help both sides. Now, does this mean the roommates are involved? I will continue to say I don't believe the roommates had anything to do with this crime. I'm not justifying their behavior and saying that was the correct thing to do. To me and just me alone, and you can feel free to disagree at any point, this validates a thought I had that these two individuals lived a very sheltered life. They lived a life where they hadn't faced a whole lot of adversity. So when adversity came knocking, and not that anyone really knows how to prepare for this particular situation, but when adversity came knocking, they handled it the way they handled it. Inappropriate or not, that is what it is. A lot like Bryan's alibi. Is that the best alibi to use in this particular situation? Not necessarily. But as I've said, if that's what he did, then that's what he did. I don't think it's necessarily fair for me to have that one argument on Bryan's alibi, but sit here and turn that around and blast the roommates, if you understand what I'm saying. I get that people are saying they had time to clean the home and all that sort of stuff. And I, at one point in time, speculated on the idea that someone did clean the home and that's why there's so little DNA found at the home. But I'm not aware of anything within these hearings or in these court documents that indicated somebody went into that home and power cleaned. Yes, I know Dylan says she saw a suspect walking out of the home with a combat vacuum, but I don't recall any reports at this particular time of a heavy chemical smell inside the home. So I'm going to continue to say, unless there's something that comes out, that the roommates were not involved with this. They certainly made bad decisions. They made poor decisions. But that doesn't necessarily tie them to this particular crime. But let's get to the elephant in the room and this DNA found on the sheath and the sheath being tied to Bryan Kohberger. Yes, on its own, trace DNA is absolutely nothing. Trace DNA on its own is a three-legged chair with one leg. You need more surrounding that trace DNA for it to be valid. Now, according to the state, they have Bryan Kohberger's trace DNA on the sheath, which once again I said on its own is crap. I've said it numerous times, the state has to tie that sheath to Bryan Kohberger. And according to that most recent document, they are tying it to Bryan Kohberger by saying he purchased it on Amazon. They have proof he purchased this on Amazon, so that sheet belongs to Bryan. And make no mistake about it, it is 100% a bad fact for the defense. It is a problem for the defense. I'm not going to sugarcoat it for you. Look, in terms of evidence, in my own personal opinion, I would put ownership of the sheath as a 1A. 1B being the cell phone activity the night of the crime. Did Bryan turn his phone off? Did he switch it to airplane mode or did it lose signal? It seems like the state is able to prove that that sheath belonged to Bryan. So it's also no longer fair to get on this channel and say that there's no way this could be Bryan. This isn't even possible. There is 100% a possibility here. We need a lot more. Individuals making videos saying that means Bryan is toast are absolutely incorrect in my own unprofessional opinion. I would not personally consider this and this alone to be Bryan Kohberger's toast. Now, he's certainly a slice of bread that has been moved from the loaf and close to the toaster, But they still need more. They still need to put him inside the home and tie him to the area during the night of the attack. Now, if the state can continue to stack this evidence against Brian with valid proof, then the circumstances surrounding his actions are more than enough to prove he committed this crime. And I think if we're being fair and we're being honest and we're being objective, a lot of us would have that same opinion. I've said it on this channel numerous times. I'm not going to condemn a guy off hearsay and a gut feeling. I don't believe that's how our justice system works. I didn't understand it then, and I don't understand it now, why people were so willing very early on to condemn this guy off so little information. Is there enough information here now to condemn this guy forever? Not yet. But there's certainly more to this story, as we have talked about in the past. The burden still falls on the state. This story still needs to be talked about fairly. This is still not necessarily open and shut. But in terms of proving who committed the crime, ownership of the sheath is crucial. And it seems that that sheath belonged to Brian. Now we're going to get to the clicks in a second and the other problems with the state's argument. But nobody should be feeling upset right now or bothered. We're in this thing for justice, and we're in this thing for answers, and we're in this thing for transparency. Because that's what we want at the end of the day. You do not get justice by compounding an injustice. What happened to those 4 individuals was sad, horrific, and wrong. We want justice for those 4 individuals. But we also don't want to see another Richard Allen or Karen Reed situation where somebody's being thrown over the coals just because the state wants to give a name to the townspeople. Because that's not how this works. But this is one closer step to proving Brian did it. Make no mistake about it. Anybody saying this means nothing is absolutely incorrect, and they're selling you a bill of goods. I'm always going to be fair. I'm always going to be honest. And before you say this is a load of crap, let's keep something in mind. This is the channel where we believe Richard Allen is innocent. So I am a skeptic, and I'm looking at this story with skeptical eyes. This answers one of our big questions. Who owns the sheath? Now, in terms of problems for the state and the stuff the state still needs to answer, listen to this.
Okay, I want to bring in my friend Mark Aragos now. He's a criminal defense attorney, and now he's the co-host of count them, two very popular podcasts, Reasonable Doubt and Two Angry Men. Mark Aragos, since you are the biggest expert I know in famous trials, I wanted to call you about all of these new details that have come out in these court documents after a desert, for 2.5 years, a gag order that's kept us all in the dark. I look at this as the layman and say he's finished. He's absolutely finished.
And I look at this as a layperson saying, okay, you show me something, but show me everything else. Let's all understand something. Take this picture here that just came out that the state is wanting to use showing Brian having bushy eyebrows. Now that is what they're saying the defense is fighting, and of course we know why the defense is fighting it. And we know why the state picked it. This is a picture taken shortly after the attacks, where it shows Brian making a very odd and weird smile, giving a thumbs up. And the state probably wants to use this picture and give the time reference of this picture because they want people to think, look how proud he is after he committed this horrible crime. But if this picture does come in, there are some problems for the state when you think about it based off the story they're trying to say. The story surrounding this particular situation is Brian went over there, he committed this crime, he went back to his apartment, he cleaned up, he got rid of the shower curtain, and then he did whatever it was he did until he went to Pennsylvania. But look at this picture here. You see an individual who is apparently squeaky clean. No red marks, no DNA. There's no DNA on the bathroom. And what you have on the side there is a shower curtain. So y'all are trying to say Brian went to his home, hurried up and cleaned, but left the shower curtain up? That doesn't necessarily make sense. I see no stains on anything in that bathroom. Now, is it a creepy picture? Is it a weird picture? Absolutely. But if I'm not knowing anything about this particular case and I'm looking at this picture right here, I'm thinking you're trying to tell me that this guy right here, who looks like he's one day away from full-body carpal tunnel, attacked those 4 individuals and they didn't make a sound, they didn't alert anybody. There are still hurdles within this story. Yes, he owns the sheath. That sheath was found at the crime scene and his trace DNA was found on the sheath. But the state still has stuff they need to prove in order to prove he did this beyond a reasonable doubt. Because looking at this picture right here, there are loads of reasonable doubt. This dude looks unhealthy. This guy looks like he hasn't seen the sunlight in 20 years. He looks like a pencil pusher, not a fighter. And he overpowered 4 individuals, and none of those individuals made a sound to alert the other roommates there was an attacker inside the home. And let's also understand there has been no talk of a plea deal that we're aware of. And you would think that if Brian is as smart as everybody says he is, then he would be wanting some sort of plea deal to save his life. And that doesn't seem to be the case that we know of. Now, is that the case because he knows he didn't commit this crime? Or is that the case because he knows the state can't actually prove what happened that night? I've said it in the past and I'll continue to say it. This crime does make more sense with more than one person. Especially this person right here. He does not look like he is in any type of physical shape to fight all four individuals, much less fight all four individuals and them not make a sound. Now, is it impossible? No, it's not. It is completely possible, but it is kind of improbable. It doesn't seem likely. But there's more. Listen to this.
He bought a K-bar knife, a sheath, and a sharpener 8 months before the and then he bought a replacement K-bar knife, or was looking for a replacement K-bar knife and sheath right after the murder.
The only thing I'll say with that, when they're talking about he was looking for a replacement, they're referencing that second search that started in November 1st. And I don't believe that's something the state should necessarily hang its hat on, because the crime wasn't committed on November 1st. And I believe this ties to what the defense has been saying, that that knife and sheath were stolen. Because why would he be looking for a knife and sheath on November 1st when the crimes were committed much later? He already had his weapon and his sheath, so there was no need for him to search. In terms of reasonable doubt, does this cast reasonable doubt into the story? How is the state going to say, well, he's searching for a sheath and he's searching for a knife during the time of the attacks? And the defense is going to say, well, these searches cover November 1st. These crimes didn't happen on November 1st. Our client lost that knife and sheath, and we have reason to believe it is stolen. Is that something the jury's going to buy? As I've said, the state still has some holes that they need to fill. Proving ownership of the knife sheath is one of those holes. It does change the story. Don't let anybody tell you this doesn't change the story. This is something, but we need to see more to prove beyond a reasonable doubt.
And then you just add all this other stuff on. But what do you think about this massive document dump?
If I'm not mistaken, you and I talked about a while ago, as you said, it's been quite a time period of wandering around in the wilderness. But I think we talked about the fact that if they had a receipt for this knife or this sheath, obviously they didn't find the knife, sometime prior, that would be, as you call it, a bad fact. The one after, the searching after, the way it was phrased and the way it was buried leads me to believe it's not as significant as the purchase before. And why do I
absolutely
say that? I've had cases where prosecutors will argue that somebody went looking for a particular item on the internet, and then when you drill down into it, it turns out that it was just one in a stream of thousands of things that the browser does. So the one after doesn't really do much. If they can tie the sheath or the same kind prior to this, that's definitely going to be front and center of their opening statement and the trial. For the prosecution and the defense is going to have some explanation.
Right. I would also say I did not see a K-bar knife or a knife sheath or a knife sharpener on the manifest 100%. When they pulled everything out of his apartment a couple months later. So that's a bad fact, too. Where is that knife and sheath that's identical to the weapon and the sheath if it's not in your apartment and you just bought it, less than a year ago? So, okay, the other thing I wanted to ask you about is these conditions, these developmental conditions, developmental coordination disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, and autism. These are the things she's saying make it impossible for him to have been able to run through that house as fast as he would have needed to commit all of those. And that this is the one I can't believe. The OCD made him drive around at night, wear gloves. When they arrested him, he was wearing gloves and sorting his trash into little plastic baggies, and change out his shower curtain all the time due to mold. And then the other one was was autism, to say he has a piercing stare and he's strange. So don't judge a book by the cover.
He's got a
good answer. It just sounds to me like it's a desperate attempt to find something, anything, to chip away at the bad facts, but it doesn't look like much of a chipper.
Look, there's each one of those taken separately, I think could give you a plausible, it's a circumstantial evidence case. The law on circumstantial evidence in most jurisdictions is if there are two reasonable interpretations, they don't have to be equally reasonable, but two reasonable explanations. One points towards guilt, one towards innocence. You must adopt the one that points towards
100%.
innocence. The problem, as you've outlined it, if in fact they're going to make those arguments, and I don't know that they necessarily are for each one of those facts. For instance, I'll take one of them out of your litany. The one about gloves and the trash later on, I'm not so sure that that's admissible as a probative fact, and it may be more prejudicial than probative. Why do I say that? That was a long period of time afterwards. If there was nothing in that trash that they found that was incriminating, why would you bring that in other than to just unfairly malign? So I don't know that that would necessarily be the one. I'll give you the prosecution argument is going to be, of course, he's going to try and use that for the shower curtain because he was trying to dispose of the shower curtain because the shower curtain was consistent with somebody who wanted to wash off any kind of the remnants of transferred DNA.
But yet in the picture taken right after the attack, you can see the shower curtain still on the rod. But he is right. This whole story about the gloves and destroying evidence, and that's the reason they rushed into the home in Pennsylvania. Did they actually find him destroying evidence? That isn't something that has came out. And if they didn't find him destroying evidence, I don't necessarily believe that should come in at trial. But as we've seen with the ownership of the sheath, there is way more to this story. Now, if they did find something okay, this is another one of these situations where they're starting to stack up stories to back up their particular side of the case. And it is something the defense is going to have to address if they want to cast reasonable doubt.
So that's a tough fact, ultimately, that they're going to have to deal with. But I'll go back to the sheet. There still is, Ashley, there have been internet sleuths who have talked repeatedly about whether or not somebody took that sheath from him, and that's the reason you had the fingerprints. So if that does not undercut the theory if they're going to say, yeah, it was mine, but somebody took it, and here's who that person is.
Then where's the knife that was bought with the sheath? Like, that's great if you still have the knife, but my sheath was taken and planted with my DNA on that snap. It's just a little far-fetched to say, and I just lost that knife, coincidentally,
No, I think if the defense is going to be that somebody took the knife and sheath, and that is, yes, it's got his DNA, but the reason it's got his DNA because it was his, somebody else took it. We don't know what happened with the knife because they took it. Yes, it was his, but he was not the person who was there. I believe that's got to be, if they've linked this up, assuming everything, that has to be the defense.
Crazy, because the handle of the knife would definitely have more of his DNA on it if someone wanted to plant his evidence at the scene, and the sheath had almost nothing on it, but okay.
And this is one of those situations. You want to be fair, you want to be objective, but is them saying the knife and the sheath were stolen going a bridge too far? I don't necessarily believe it's a bridge gone too far, but if they're going to make the argument that somebody stole that knife and sheath, they're going to have to give a name of a possible suspect. And then they're going to have proof that that individual did take that weapon. The defense can't just simply get up there and say, somebody stole this, we don't know who, and a jury believe it. That's the problem when you start talking about these conspiracy stories. If the defense is going to raise a conspiracy, the jury's going to want to hear who. They're going to want to hear the what, they're going to want to hear the why. Simply saying, my client didn't do it because this piece of evidence is missing, we don't know who took it, isn't necessarily something a jury's going to buy. Especially if the state is able to stack up facts. The state in this situation is already going to be able to prove that that sheath belonged to him. And if we're being fair and we're being objective, what are you going to say if the state is able to prove that was Brian in the car? That he turned off his cell phone? That that's his trace DNA? And in fact, he wasn't actually at the park that night, he was in Moscow. All those things stacked on top of each other. Who else could it be but Brian? Now, once again, it is up to them to prove each one of these things. We don't know if they have the proof for all of those things. But if you look back and read the court documents and you remember everything within these hearings, something I found that was funny after the fact, and I understand hindsight's 2020, but in terms of ownership of the sheath, I cannot recall Ann Taylor talking about that very much or at all. It seems she does want to avoid ownership of the sheath the same way the state wants to avoid this unidentified bell DNA. It is a problem and it is an issue for the defense, just like that DNA is a problem for the state. But that is my take on these most recent updates. Trace DNA on its own is absolute crap, but if you have a story to back it up, it does mean something. The more the state can back up, the more and more it would mean that Brian committed these crimes. This doesn't mean he's guilty as of now, but it certainly doesn't mean it's impossible. And as always, if you disagree, you can let me know down in the comments below. But if you do enjoy this and a more fair, open conversation, maybe check one of these videos out. Y'all be safe now.